Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. It's KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California. It's broadcast number 676, November the 19th, 1984. We go over and review what was happening a year ago this week. I like to do that and share that with you. That was broadcast 6/24, November 21st, 1983, on the 20th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Larry Flynt was to get out a magazine called The Rebel. I did the original opening story for it. It was on the Fourth Reich and the Kennedy assassination. And I don't know how many of you listeners have it, but I can make copies and let you know what the cost is if you want it. The Rebel isn't published anymore. It was a very important article on the years of the war period, during the war, even before we got into the war, from 1940 to 45. We weren't in it till 41. The role of John J. McCloy, Allen Dulles, Charles Willoughby, J. Edgar Hoover, and the transition from the United States OSS to the CIA, and the use of Reinhard Gehlen into the United States intelligence system, and the role that they played as they built their power base eventually in Dallas, Texas, where John Kennedy was murdered, the links of specific Nazis to the Kennedy assassination, and members of the Warren Commission who were close with those Nazis, and the role of putting them on the commission when Allen Dulles and John J. McCloy, when they worked so carefully with Nazi war criminals, and John J. McCloy had released many of them, who then came back and played some part in the assassination of John Kennedy. As soon as Larry Flynt got this idea of the Rebel and the magazine out, he was completely infiltrated with agents, and I was discussing that a year ago on the program, saying a couple of house guests moved in and mentioned Gordon Novell and Mitchell Werbel. Well, after November, it kept getting worse, and there was G. Gordon Liddy and Timothy Leary. I call them the A-team, moved in. As a matter of fact, on the telephone a few weeks ago, Gordon Novell had called David Emery up north while he was on a radio program. And off the air, he said, yes, I did, and Larry Flynt. Those guys were there to stop the Rebel, stop Larry Flynt's work into politics that he started once before, a few years ago, and was shot. This time, Larry and his wife were drugged, and the first time I noticed that he was really drugged and losing his mind was November the 12th, 1983. And I told him that, but he had to run the full course, because when you are drugged, you can't get that message across to a person. Their mind is blocked out, and it's difficult to receive it. It was a very difficult year. A lot of hopes went into the Rebel, a lot of disappointment and sadness, a year of turmoil, and watching what happened to Larry Flynt being destroyed, like you take the wings off of an insect. He got into the big league with this kind of publication. This is very important material he was printing, and he wasn't careful enough about the people that he let into the Hustler over at Century City or into his home, and the whole thing came crashing down. Now, there's a story today in the Chronicle, San Francisco Chronicle Examiner, and also yesterday's paper that I'm briefly going to mention, and I'm going to do a lot more on it next week, but I wanted to stick mostly with the Kennedy assassination on the 21st anniversary of Kennedy's assassination and share new information with you, and linking it to Ronald Reagan's past and his early religious fundamentalist backing that he had long before he was president and before he was even governor. But the article that's in the paper has to do with the actor Rossano Brazzi. You may have seen that in your newspapers around the country. Brazzi. He was well known in the movie South Pacific, Three Coins and a Fountain, and other pictures, and he has been indicted for smuggling in Rome. This 5-year investigation has whispered about his name before, but now he's been brought in as a co-defendant with Bekir Selenik, C-E-L-E-N-K, Selink, the fellow that has also been charged on the plot to kill Pope John Paul II, working with Mr. Ajah, one of the major people in that assassination plot. Mr. Brazzi has been indicted now. He has been charged with conspiring to sell missiles and tanks and advanced weapons and atomic bombs to various Arab countries. And the two of them, Brazzi and Selink, are involved not only with the weapons, but, as I say, there was the assassination attempt on the Pope. Now, trying to get the Pope would have triggered, if they had done it, would have triggered World War III. If you could link it to the Soviets and the Bulgarians and say that the Soviets were responsible for what the Bulgarian agents did. And the other part of this story is the Armageddon that we're hearing about so much from Ronald Reagan and the fundamentalist preachers, but well-known people such as Mr. Rossano Brazzi, who is a friend of Ronald Reagan's, an associate of Frank Sinatra, known each other since 1948, going back those long early days. Brazzi is tied up to the P2, the Masonic Lodge, to Mussolini's terror squad, Silicio Jelly, and to the assassination of the Pope, the attempt on the Pope, and selling atomic weapons to Arab nations that could start over in Israel, the Armageddon. This is a convoluted, complicated story of individuals, some names I've had on the program before, but I'll do more on it because it really takes 1 hour just as a starter, and maybe I'll do a 2 or 3 part program on it, but that is in the news right now. Another story that you can look for, I worry about, talked about before, surfaced in Houston, Texas, not in the newspaper, but in front of the courthouse. A subscriber to these broadcasts, a friend who sends me articles every single week, just marvelous packets from the Houston Post, you see me quoting it all the time, told me about somebody who went to the courthouse, had jury duty last week, and saw young kids, I don't know the age, passing out flyers and getting signatures for a petition to change the Constitution to allow Henry Kissinger to run for President of the United States. Are you ready for that one? I knew that would be happening. Remember in the early 70s, I said Ronald Reagan would be running for President of the United States, and I was practically booed off the stages where I was speaking at different places because the audience was sure that Nelson Rockefeller would be President of the United States. Well, Rockefeller ended in the grave, and Reagan was President. So if I was right about that one, you better watch the next one, because how do we know that this isn't the offing? I know it positively is. Now, one of the things that is really scary about this is that the budget, the deficit that's so huge, I believe it's being allowed to get out of hand, the military spending, various spendings, way off the top of what we can't even pay the interest on at this point. And it will get so bad that there will be a demand from the Democrats and Republicans for a constitutional convention. And when the convention is called, that's when they're going to slip in the amendment that changes the Constitution that a foreign-born can't be President of the United States. And then we will have the Fuhrer, Henry Kissinger, and the armbands and goose step will begin. And you'll find that he isn't the Jew boy or the little Jew that Fritz Kramer talked about, but he's the Nazi behind the various movements in all the countries that I run down over and over again. Just see your morning's paper. Here's one article. Troops round up the male population of Shantytown. Chilean sees 3,000 young men. This is what Henry Kissinger gave you. If you have to remind it every day of what's going on, Chile is one of his great accomplishments. So in Houston, Texas, of all places, the home of conservatism, fundamentalism, and all that goes down there with the H.L. Hunts and the Brown and Roots and the John Connallys and the who's who of the assassination team, out of Houston, Texas, the petitions wanting little Henry Kissinger to be the President of the United States. I'm not shocked, and I am shocked. I just have to pass that on. Now, I want to go to a few items on the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi before we go on to the John Kennedy material, because I don't want to lose track of some very important articles that have come out this past week that you might not have seen or heard about. NBC had a program, this is November the 17th, 1984, 545 News, the main national news, and they mentioned on the program that there was a large plot to kill Mrs. Gandhi planned long before May or June. It had nothing to do with going into the Golden Temple. She was going to be murdered, and this was arranged ahead of time. And as I said before, these assassination plots hatch 3 or 4 years ahead. If this system and NATO and the president want to kill Andres Papandreou, they're planning it now. They're setting their agents now because he isn't a good boy, not doing what they want. So I knew that this was planned a long time ago, and that they created the excuse for killing her and the motives for killing her, as I said they did with John Kennedy and the Bay of Pigs. And I said there was that 4-year lapse, or 1960 to the end of 1963, almost 4 years, when the planning wheels went in motion to kill John Kennedy. So this information on NBC confirms what I know is happening, and have mentioned to you before how long and complicated it is to do these things, but if you've studied them, as I have for 20 years, it takes you about 2 weeks to figure out where it's coming from. The San Francisco Chronicle had a story November 17th. India asked Norway to extradite a Sikh. Mr. Harinder Singh, Harinder. I don't have to use the last name. That is the appropriate name for all of the Sikhs. As I mentioned before, they have that last name. He's deputy chief of the Indian embassy in Oslo, Norway, and they've asked him, there's been an appeal, and asked him to come back, not get political asylum in Norway, because his name has been mentioned, and the survivor of the 2 assassination teams right on the ground there evidently mentioned his name. They want Harinder Singh from Norway. That's one of the assassination team members that is overseas that they want. New Times from the Soviet Union had a story in August before Mrs. Gandhi was murdered. $1 million for the murder. Yes, £1 million in sterling, not rupees, but £1 million has been offered by Cohn, Chauhan. I mentioned him last week from London, who has offered $1 million even a while back for the murder of Mrs. Gandhi. He wants his cash, and he says, this article in the New Times says that he is familiar with American dollars. With the CIA, he has more than once bragged of being on intimate terms in the pay of the CIA, and then it goes on to say that his mission, another person that they wanted, the international terrorist Paramit Singh, Paramit, his mission of Paramit, not Chon, the other, and there's 2. Paramit was to go into the temple to meet with Bin Randwale, the fellow that was murdered, and meet him secretly, and then murder Mrs. Gandhi. So the plan was to murder Mrs. Gandhi, and the $1 million was offered before Mr. Bin Randwale was killed, unless he was killed inside the Golden Temple by one of his own, as our CIA manual suggests to the guerrillas and the terrorists to create a martyr. But his mission was to go there and meet with him. And then his next target was to be India's President Zail, Z-A-I-L, Singh, S-I-N-G-H again. And he would be sent by the Foreign Secret Service, this terrorist operation, for killing in India. And they would draw this huge amount of money and a check. And this report has to do with the Delhi airport where somebody was arrested, Mr. Jagir Singh, J-A-G-I-R, on July 20th. And he had plotted with others to assassinate the leaders in the country and work with the conspirators, and said that he received money from the United States, a CIA agent with a question mark. And most likely, this article says, as I say, this is from New Times Magazine, $1 million for a murder, and mentions 3 different people that were involved with the plot. The Washington Times has a story November 16th. The accused links foreigners to the Gandhi plot. That is the survivor who is talking now. He's left the hospital and he's now been taken to a jail. But he is talking about the plans to kill Mrs. Gandhi, and he claimed that the extremists got their support from Sikh separatists based in Britain, the United States, Canada, and West Germany. The survivor of the 2 assassins, didn't claim that in India. They were claiming that, and Mrs. Gandhi was claiming that. And as I mentioned last week, one of the men who arranged for the 2 killers to be in a certain position did leave for Canada, but they're looking, as I say, in Norway. Lots of luck. I'm sure it'll be hard to find in Canada the American-trained Sikh that got extradited there, or many of the others who are around the world, well-trained assassination teams, and they know how to hit, and they know how to leave their patsies, and they have good mind control and good motivations. The kamikaze concept is alive and well, and the planners are home free again. The Washington Post had a long article, almost half a page. Moscow seen continuing propaganda, hints of U.S. role in Gandhi death. Now, Ronald Reagan, according to this article, is simply furious. He says he deeply resented the Kremlin suggesting that the United States was involved with the hit on Mrs. Gandhi. The Soviets risk, this is a quote, damaging very severely any hope of improving U.S. relations if they keep up that campaign. Now, if the Soviet Union finds that we have killed a political person, such as even our own president, John Kennedy, or say Mrs. Gandhi. If they mention it, then the president says, well, there's no chance of us getting along with you. We'll need more weapons to fight you if you're going to keep that talk. But for their own safety and for their own true historic purposes, if they want such a thing, or if they want to put us on the line for killing these people, in addition to having the manual on how to kill, it seems to be working. The president is showing that he's angry about this kind of talk. Now, the Washington Post says in the past, India is a fertile ground for Soviet disinformation, and they talked about a secret cable by U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Eugene Kirkpatrick, outlining a U.S. strategy to promote the Balkanization of India and thereby subvert Indian influence in the region. Now, they say it was forged, but I'm not sure it was forged, and we don't know if it was forged. That sounds just like Jean Kirkpatrick would want to do it. She's in charge of our Central American policies and has a good job of sabotaging and balkanizing those places. So because the Washington Post says that's a forged document doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't pick up a conversation or a meeting that Jean Kirkpatrick went to. In fact, they said they lifted it out of context and altered it in a false cable. But I'm sure verbatim or out of context, the intent was that, and that's what they put together, what she was saying about India long before Mrs. Gandhi was killed. The Washington Post talks about the problem the United States will have irritating India with weapons for Pakistan, and that the U.S. banks, the foreign banks, don't want to give loans to India. There's opposition to Asian Development Bank loans to India, and so the United States wants to show we'll get along, we like you, we can work with Rajiv, but we still have the problem of weapons for Pakistan and not giving money for them to have the same benefits the other countries have. The story in the Christian Science Monitor, Gandhi killers, why weren't they kept away? And this talks about the man who gave the first 3 shots and then the other one who had the final blast, and BNT is the survivor of the 2 men who shot at Mrs. Gandhi. He gave just 3 quick shots, and then she got a whole barrage from the other gunman. And this article says that he was unknown to Mrs. Gandhi, and on the morning of her murder, he was facing her. But on the other side of the gate, unknown to Mrs. Gandhi, was Satwant Singh, the fellow who was killed on the spot, and he was new to her staff. I guess he got the Lee Harvey Oswald treatment right there. He had just been with her a short time. He was new on the staff. He had returned on duty just the Monday before she was killed. He spent 2 months in the Punjab area, and there was even talk that his brother had been killed in the Golden Temple. So this was what the fellow who was taking all the shots at her and had been hired just as a new guard. And boy, you can be suspicious at a time of trouble having new guards and not checking them out thoroughly, or what they were doing to their summer vacation. The same day that Ms. Gandhi died, there was an article in the Washington Times, Pakistan close to completing atomic arms, the report states. They're on the verge of joining the world's nuclear club. They're capable of building atomic bombs that could trigger reaction in neighboring India to develop nuclear arms. So the day that she was killed, this report was released from the Carnegie Endowment for an International Peace that Pakistan now had atomic bombs, and here was Reagan and China getting ready to develop militarily the weapon system there. As a matter of fact, this week, Alexander Haig flew to China to deliver airplanes, fighter planes to China. He went personally to see that they were in place and delivered, and have a little party to celebrate China receiving these airplanes, the Sikorsky airplanes that are made by United Technology that he was president of and is still affiliated with. Another story, 12 days after her death, the Wall Street Journal, Pakistan seeking $91 million credit for Boeing airplanes. So Pakistan wants the Western banks this week, now that Mrs. Gandhi's out of the way and India is destabilized and Pakistan delivered. If the Pakistanis trained for the CIA, the Sikhs that killed Mrs. Gandhi, there won't be anything stopping anything they want, because they can then blackmail the United States like all the other countries do very nicely. So 12 days after she's killed and delivered, they've asked for $91 million, and they're going to buy Boeing 737 jets. And I'll tell you, I'll bet you anything it goes through. the article says there's some question about the third world debt, but this third world delivered, and so now they can escalate the arms of Pakistan, hoping then, of course, to use them against Afghanistan and the Soviet Union from that vantage point. November 14th, another story, secret arrest in the assassination of Gandhi. The police commando that she had was held and arrested the day that she was shot. Jagtar Singh, Jagtar, who was in charge of her security. He has been involved in what they call a criminal conspiracy hatched for the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi. Isn't it interesting, 21 years after the murder of John Kennedy, how fast they're getting into these assassination teams, such as the one in the Philippines of Aquino and also of Mrs. Gandhi. They're working much faster now. They're not taking so many years to find out who the assassins are. Now, I do want to make one or two comments about Svetlana Stalin going home. It was quite a coincidence that the day that she went into the Soviet Union was the exact day that Mrs. Gandhi was shot in India. And the excuse for Svetlana leaving the Soviet Union in the first place, that she had a friend, a Sikh, a close friend, in quotes, who lived in India. And when he died, she took the ashes over to India in December 1966 on the excuse that she wanted to put the ashes in the Ganges as a religious service. And at the time, I had the feeling that he probably was murdered so that this man died young so that she would have an excuse to leave the Soviet Union, and our CIA Gehlen agents in the Soviet would have a major coup, getting her over here and into the United States. So she went over the border and went to New Delhi, stayed there a couple of months, and then was in the arms of the CIA March 1967. But I believe those 2 months, January and February, were all prearranged, because then she went to Switzerland and flew to the home of Priscilla Johnson Macmillan, who was in charge of her most of the time and dragged her around. And in the London Times, she said that her CIA minders considered her their private property and a personal pet. And she said in another syndicated story across the country that she literally had no mind of her own, that they followed her. Every single day for 17 years, she didn't have a free moment. The CIA told her what to say, what to do, how to write, and she had been an author and has a mind of her own, and she really resented it. She wrote in the London Times a letter for potential defectors from the Soviet Union to think again. She said, every defector imagines that there beyond the border in the fierce free world, are people that are superhuman, wise, enlightened, not like our poor lot in the USSR. And what a terrible blow it is to find out on the other side of the world they are the same idiots, incompetent fools, frightened bureaucrats, confused bosses, paranoid fears of deception and surveillance, and all of that on the other side of the Iron Curtain. She said the discovery made a loss of idealism. You shouldn't try to come over here. Don't think of the free world as a great thing. She says there's too much propaganda telling you what goes on over there, and it isn't like you think that it is. And I'm sure the CIA watched her very, very closely. Now, Priscilla Johnson Macmillan is the woman who saw Lee Harvey Oswald in the Soviet Union. She was the CIA contact through the embassy and through the hotel when he first arrived in the Soviet Union. And I'm sure she had some way of placing him into that Minsk radio factory. We'll never know how or what. But there were Eileen Mosby, there were several writers of the CIA and many in the embassy, of course. But after Lee Harvey Oswald was killed in Dallas, Marina Oswald went right to the custody of Priscilla Johnson within a very few months. And Priscilla Johnson Macmillan took her to Sedona, Arizona. And I mentioned this before, several years ago on the program. And there were allegations of people that I knew in Sedona and got letters of mind control programs in a trailer camp. And we visited Sedona when she was there with Priscilla Johnson. And when the book Marina and Lee came out, allegedly written by Marina Oswald, but it was Priscilla Johnson Macmillan, and they were doing television shows. They were so pathetic. I think I taped some of them. And she would tell on the television how Lee Oswald beat his wife. And the person interviewing would say to Marina, did he? And she says, well, I don't know. If Priscilla said so, he did. None of the facts that Priscilla was saying made any sense to Marina Oswald, but she sat there and Priscilla bobbed her head back and forth and had total control of the interviews, and Marina Oswald and Svetlana Stalin. Now, I want to do some more on the Kennedy assassination because, as I say, it is the anniversary, and when I get out the material to do it, I just love working on that. I spent 9 years on those Warren Commission hearings and 20 years in all, and when I get out those pages, I really smile. I realize how important it is for me to get a book out on this stuff, and new resolution, January the 1st, I'll do some work. I'll write on the Kennedy assassination because it's time now. It's 21 years, and it's a full circle from as I say, the Nazi Germany to CIA and to Dallas and to Ronald Reagan. And with Reagan elected for 4 more years, and with the fundamentalists coming out of the woodwork at the Republican National Convention and the role of Falwell and Robeson and the preachers and their work with the Defense Department, now it's very clear what happened, how it happened, who was involved, and it's much easier to sit down and write a book and feel satisfied that all the other pieces that you don't have will fit into the structure that you have, and so far that has been true of all my work. Now, the Warren Report is always fun to read, and the minutes of the Warren Commission meetings are even greater. I'd like to write a play and just have people read these lines on the stage. But at the January 21st meeting of the Warren Commission, Alan Dulles was talking to the staff, members of the Warren Commission, about how much material he had, and he complained. He said, this is a quote, now this is Alan Dulles of the OSS, the CIA, who brought in the Gehlen agents, the Nazis, fired by John Kennedy, put back on the Warren Commission, not trusted by Kennedy. When Kennedy's killed, he's put there to investigate who killed him. And this is what he's saying to the gang there at one of their first meetings. They haven't heard any witnesses yet. He said, I wonder if our staff could take this tremendous mass. I've been down here a couple of days, and it is just perfectly tremendous, and 2/3 of it is of no importance. And in the sense that people say they knew something about this, and then you take them and they don't know anything. If the staff could pick up what they think is essential, I think we could rely on them because it is tremendous. Also important in the staff is that they were all cleared by the Central Intelligence Agency, and they agreed to have pregnant girls from the CIA who couldn't be active in the field. They could be working on this massive material and then go back to the agency after they finished the job. He said, the amount of material we have is as high as this room, the raw reports and the other reports. And he said, I don't think the members of this commission, ourselves, without devoting all our time and more, could ever read all this stuff. And J. Lee Rankin, the attorney for the Warren Commission, said, I think it would take 30 days to read it and digest it. Well, I'll tell you, it took me 9 years with no radio broadcast to work and read it and digest it, and it has taken me another 12 years to reread it and see things that didn't ring a bell the first time and digest what this massive amount of material amounted to. Now, J. Lee Rankin thinks it would take 30 days. I don't know whether that includes your Saturdays or Sundays off. The FBI had narrowed down that material that they didn't destroy to 25,000 interviews, 2,300 reports, 25,400 pages of documents. The Secret Service had another 5,550 interviews, 800 reports, and 4,600 pages. So that must be pretty good speed reading for 30 days, but that's what they were going to allow themselves, the luxury of looking into who killed John Kennedy and then telling you and having the information in 30 days. Now, the Torba document I've referred to many times. It came out in 1970, a very important document written by David Copeland, an attorney in Texas who worked with various people involved in the assassination or part of the assassination. And he wrote this. It's privately published for researchers, and it was duplicated, and you can get copies from research out in Aptos. In the Torbett document, I'm going to take 1 or 2 pages and then go on to more current documents just to cite some of this information. One of the matters they go into at great length in there is the group, the Solidaris, and they are described in the Torbett document as the Solidaris are a vast number of agents within Russia, and they have a common anti-communist objective with J. Edgar Hoover. They worked continuously with the anti-Castro Cubans who considered that their country was filled with an occupying force. So the Cuban exiles and the Solidaris wanting to take back the Soviet Union, the Cuban exiles take back Cuba, and Division 5 of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, worked closely with them. Now, We'll take a 1-minute break and then continue on with the Solidaris and Marina Oswald. This is Mae Brussell. It's broadcast number 676, November the 19th, 1984, and this is side 2 of the broadcast. The Solidaris also, besides being within the Soviet Union, were distributed all through the United States and to various countries overseas, and the Dallas-Fort Worth people that Lee and Marina associated with were all members of Alan Dulles Reinhard Gehlen's Solidaris. Now, George de Mohrenschildt, the mentor of Lee and Marina Oswald, who met them in June 1962 when they came home from the Soviet Union and provided the introductions for the ways they would get jobs, the way he would get jobs, housing, and so forth. George de Mohrenschildt testified in Volume 9 of the Warren Commission hearings, page 267, that he wanted to tell Albert Jenner, the attorney, about the Solidaris. So he went on and explained that it was a political party of Russian refugees, and he mentioned Mr. and Mrs. Voshinin, who live in the Dallas area, that are members of the Solidaris, pro-American group of Russian refugees. He says they're a pretty well-known political party. Their headquarters are in Germany. So that was, interestingly enough, that he didn't identify it as the Gehlen operation, but he worked for our Defense Department and for our spy teams, and he did know that the location of the headquarters was in Germany, which was Reinhard Gehlen's BND. Now, the Torbett document goes into another person or persons that begin to get close to the Ronald Reagan administration in his early career. And the Torbett document says another organization participating with Division 5 was the religious group called the American Council of Christian Churches. And the West Coast representative was Edgar Eugene Bradley, who was indicted by the New Orleans grand jury for conspiracy and the assassination of John Kennedy. And J. Edgar Hoover wanted Edgar Eugene Bradley to be president of the United States. He had once there were campaign records in 1954. And Bradley worked for a close friend of J. Edgar Hoover's, a close friend, Reverend Carl McIntyre. They began their work in 1941, after Pearl Harbor, when the OSS was set up. J. Edgar Hoover sent agents over to London, and the books by Kim Philby and about Kim Philby, the spy, tell how J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI sent agents to London with the OSS, and Carl McIntyre helped a worldwide organization in the United States and Latin America to use the American Council of Christian Churches with the headquarters in New York City for espionage, to organize espionage and intelligence, and they were the people that set up the assassination teams down in Mexico. And Edgar Hoover coordinated all of this through Division 5 of the FBI, and Mr. Bradley was not extradited to New Orleans to stand trial with the evidence that Jim Garrison had, for the simple reason that Edwin Meese III refused to send him. The Monterey Herald has a story going back to those days when Jim Garrison was trying to get him extradited, and Ed Meese and Ronald Reagan refused to do it. But there were a lot of good reasons why they refused, and it didn't seem to make that much sense in those days, but the Ronald Reagan church group and using the church for political espionage activities began, as I say, early in his career. And because Bradley and McIntyre link to the church groups that are also tied into Reagan's friends and co-workers, of course he wasn't going to send Mr. Bradley back to New Orleans. That's the American Council of Christian Churches with Edgar Eugene Bradley and Carl McIntyre working for the FBI. Also in this same saga, the Torbett document, there's a list of principal financiers of Permindex. Permindex, I've mentioned many times, is the organization, the front, set up for assassination teams that looks like a business operation but isn't and wasn't, with many millions of dollars, I suppose, in their hands, goodness knows how much, that included Clay Shaw of the OSS and the CIA, and H.L. Hunt of Dallas and Clint Murchison, John de Menil of Schlumberger, John Connolly. But the only two I want to mention right now, because I've mentioned many of them before, is Dr. Oschner from New Orleans and Roy Cohn, the attorney from Lionel Corporation in New York, who was part of Permindex, as was Dr. Oschner. Now, this last week, there was an article in the Village Voice about Roy Cohn, Cohn's Catholic connections, and in the new book, The American Pope, about Cardinal Spellman, it makes the allegations that Roy Cohn was the conduit between Cardinal Spellman and J. Edgar Hoover. Now, Spellman hated John Kennedy and liked Richard Nixon, and Roy Cohn worked with Richard Nixon in the House Un-American activities and had an early history helping the career of Richard Nixon in the Congress. So this new allegation in the book claims that he was the conduit between Spellman, an organizer of the Knights of Malta, of course, out of the Archdiocese in New York, and very political, and the law office of Sachs, Bacon, and Boland. That is the Roy Cohn office, but they don't have his name on it. Mr. Boland is a Knight of Malta. I mentioned that before. They represent and do the law work for the Catholic Archdiocese of New York. Spellman was the Cardinal of Vietnam, a very political cardinal. And, of course, the Vietnam War gave many weapon contracts to people like Jean de Menil of Schlumberger or Brown and Root and the various people mentioned here. It was a very profitable war for these people, and none of them, of course, were killed. It was a lot of business and a lot of bucks. And the other name that is in the Torba document that came out in 1970 is Dr. Oschner. Now, right after the assassination, within hours of the assassination, maybe 1 hour, there were pictures on the television of Lee Harvey Oswald saying he was a Marxist. And Ed Butler, a fellow from an organization called INCA, I-N-C-A, Information Council of America, which he described as a private, non-profit educational organization, made a record called Lee Harvey Oswald Speaks. But before the record was made, he was on the television, and you heard in Oswald's own words that he was a Marxist. What they didn't tell you about that speech was the role that Ed Butler had with military intelligence, or that he worked for Patrick Frawley in California. Patrick Frawley from Technicolor and Schick razor blades, and very profitable, and Technicolor. The Technicolor films and the Schick and the fountain pen, the ballpoint pen. That's one of the first things he and a friend of hers, Ed Edinger, invented, was the ballpoint pen, the Papermate pen. So he had 3 huge businesses going. And Mr. Patrick Frawley, a Knight of Malta, and his wife is a Dame of Malta, very conservative Catholic, was the man, the original man behind the career of Ronald Reagan, going way back to the early days in California, gathering the kitchen cabinet. He was the rock-bottom base of Reagan's career, and he also hired and was literally the godfather of Ed Butler, who just coincidentally was making the record in New Orleans that would seal the fate of Oswald, a Marxist. Now, the record says Lee Harvey Oswald speaks his own words. The reason Oswald of military intelligence, or CIA and FBI, and Butler could make a record together would be for the reason that Lee Harvey Oswald was going down to Mexico to apply to go into Cuba. And he could do spying in Cuba like he did in the Soviet Union, drawing tractor sites, watching airplanes above, and having a secretary when he came home, Mrs. Bates, to dictate the notes of what he saw when he was a spy in the Soviet Union. So overtly, Oswald had to hand out handbills in front of Clay Shaw's trademark and be photographed. The cameras were on him. And he had to give a radio program, an interview with Ed Butler, so that the pro-Castro Cubans could say his bona fides are good. Here's a guy who seems to like us. So he was used by Butler, who is, I say, a protege and just a right arm of Patrick Frawley in the New Orleans scene. Now, on the back of the record, the album, there's a picture of Ed Butler. Then there's a picture of Senator Thomas Dodd. There's 3 men that speak on the record, and one of them is Dr. Alton Oschner, mentioned in the Torba document as being a funder of the Permindex, the assassination team. So here, these 4 men are on the album. 1, Ed Butler of Army Intelligence, who makes the interview with Oswald. 2 is Dr. Alton Oschner, famed surgeon, past president of the American Cancer Society, president of INCA, with Ed Butler. Now, Oschner also is on the board with Patrick Frawley out in California, and we'll go into that, and he's part of Permindex. And Oschner is saying, we now know that by killing President Kennedy, Oswald diverted attention from Cuba and wanted to prolong Castro's power. The other person, one of the persons on the album, is the Honorable Hale Boggs, congressman from Louisiana, who becomes a member of the Warren Commission. And on the album, he says that within a few hours after President Kennedy's death, I sat with Ed Butler in my office in the Capitol and listened to this recording. So Hale Boggs is going to be put on the Warren Commission by Lyndon Johnson, and within hours of when Kennedy was killed, Hale Boggs is told through Oswald's own voice via Ed Butler that Oswald is a Marxist. So one member of the Warren Commission already knows what he wants to think, and there's no reason to go to many meetings, and he didn't. Another person on the album who has a voice in the matter is Senator Thomas Dodd, described as vice chairman of the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, former prosecutor of the Nazi criminals at Nuremberg, the ones that got off, the former special agent of the FBI, who says Oswald was a simple crackpot who acted without any understanding or motivation, but this important record demolishes that because he was a Marxist. He wasn't a simple crackpot. So you've got Hale Boggs, Senator Dodd, Boggs working with Ed Butler, and the Warren Commission, Dodd from Nuremberg and the FBI having a motive in the assassination. Now, one of the people who released all the Nazis that Dodd prosecuted at Nuremberg was John J. McCloy, who was put on the Warren Commission, and one prosecuted, the other locked up the door, the other one let him out the door. And the Nazis, like Walter Dornberger and the Solidarists of Warnschild, are used in the murder of John Kennedy, and they made this very nice record about Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, the record has a lot to say, of course, on Oswald being a very idealistic Marxist. It doesn't prove any particular point, except for the fact that he is describing that that's his political leaning, and then as soon as Oswald is arrested and killed, out comes the record. Now, Ed Butler, as I say, worked for Patrick Frawley. Frawley was very close to Ronald Reagan, to Richard Nixon, to the John Birch Society, and the Vatican, all at the same time. So the people like H.L. Hunt, who started the John Birch Society, Hunt was close to the Mormon Church, I believe, a Mormon wife and a Protestant wife. He was not a Catholic, H.L. Hunt. But the Vatican, the Birch Society, and the Mormons melt together in many ways that I'll explain as much as I have time for tonight. The Information of Council of Americas on this record was set up, as I say, by Army intelligence and close ties to the Vatican and to Cardinal Spellman, Mr. Patrick Frawley. And he also was described in the book Danger on the Right as the man who brought in the Christian anti-communist crusade, and I've mentioned this on other broadcasts. He's appeared with H.L. Hunt on Lifeline. Now, Warren Caroll of the CIA wrote for Lifeline and also worked with Jack Ruby, and I believe had mind-controlled him to be a hero. And so this Frawley's career is very rich in the business opportunities he had, and then he takes his money and parlays it to these social political groups, such as Ed Butler, who's involved with counterintelligence. Now, at one time, Mr. Frawley was in trouble with the Justice Department in 1970, and he had to either sell his Schick electric shaver or the wet shaving. So he decided to put the ownership, give part of it to Mr. Warner Lambert, the Warner Lambert Company, to Elmer Bobst. He sold the wet shaving part to Warner Lambert, and Frawley remained the president of it. Now, Warner Lambert, with Elmer Bobst as the head of it, was the gentleman who signed for Otto von Bolschwing to travel all over Europe. Bolschwing was Eichmann's superior, the head of the Romanian Iron Guard. He was in charge of taking property and material from the Jews in Holland, setting up the Nazi desk in Palestine that was to become Israel. He brought in William Clark and Elaine von Dahm, the secretary for Ronald Reagan that I talk about all the time. But the point is that there was a close relationship, a business relationship between Elmer Bobst and Warner Lambert, and this is the godfather of the Richard Nixon career, Elmer Bobst. And He also melts with Patrick Frawley, and Frawley remains the president of a company he has sold to Warner Lambert. There was a proxy fight over Technicolor. Some 16 directors had an argument, and some of them resigned. But on the board of Technicolor, very important for the motion picture industry and also for NASA and making a lot of films for NASA, on the board was Senator Murphy, another person that Patrick Frawley put into the Senate and then forced to resign because of conflict of interest and payments from Frawley out in California. And one of the directors of Technicolor was Dr. Robert Morris, again, a Knight of Malta, the president of that Dallas University, the fellow that brought the Nazis from Munich, Germany, via General Walker, Volkmar Schmidt, Larry Schmidt, worked with the CIA and the Republic National Bank. Robert Morris was a director of Technicolor, so that the Dallas scene of the YAF gets a little muckier with California Frawley, who is the man that got Ronald Reagan's career started. So he has Ed Butler in New Orleans working with Lee Harvey Oswald to set and seal the motive with Hale Boggs, who would be on the commission, and getting the media to know Oswald's the Marxist. And then to diffuse the Young Americans for Freedom, the William Buckley connections, and Douglas Caddy, to the YAF and to Robert Morris and the Munich gang that started coming in 1962 to prepare for the assassination. Morris is in Dallas, Butler is in New Orleans, Frawley is in California, but has a tight hold on them. Now, Frawley supported American Jewish League. That was one of the things that he was active supporting, and it's called the American Jewish League Against Communism, and this was created by Roy Cohn. So Roy Cohn, written in the Torbett document, who's the liaison between Cardinal Spellman and J. Edgar Hoover, of all things, he also works for Patrick Frawley, and he was the former aide, to Senator Joe McCarthy, put into political office with Nazis, and I've written about McCarthy's role to the Nazis in the Rebel article, so that Mr. Roy Cohn worked closely with the Cardinal Minzetti Foundation, headed by ever-sharp director Fred Schlafly and Phyllis Schlafly. So the two people that started funding the fundamentalist Christian right also were close to Roy Cohn and to Mr. Patrick Frawley, and they were on the board of Technicolor also. The Schlaflys were on the board of Technicolor along with Patrick Frawley. This was his creation. And you had Robert Morris, and there's Roy Cohn with his own organization set up by Mr. Frawley, the American Jewish League Against Communism. Now, Senator Dodd not only worked at Nuremberg and with the FBI and with Ed Butler, who's talking about Lee Harvey Oswald, but he was very influential in the Senate Internal Subcommittee. And one of the attorneys that worked with the Internal Subcommittee was Robert Morris, who was on the board of Technicolor. I hope I'm not confusing you too much, but there are interconnecting links of people I've talked about before that are very important, going back to the Torbett document and to Ronald Reagan and leading up to him in a minute. Mr. Dodd was vice chairman of the Senate Internal Subcommittee. Robert Morris, the fellow who brought in the YAF from Munich, was the chief counsel of the subcommittee. So Robert Morris is not only on the board of Technicolor with Patrick Frawley out in California, but he's the chief counsel in the Senate for Dodd's internal subcommittee. Dodd was working with Ed Butler on the record. He met with him, had that record in his hand, the recording of the radio conversation of Lee Harvey Oswald, and Butler was working at the time for Patrick Frawley. Morris brought the YF to Dallas. Morris works with Technicolor, and they all have a close bond. Ed Butler, I'm sure, had a good role with his part with Cardinal Spellman, and J. Edgar Hoover and Roy Cohn. They could be very influential in putting Hale Boggs right on the Warren Commission after his little interview with Lee Harvey Oswald, and seal on the TV and in our minds what happened when John Kennedy was killed. Now, when that Young Americans for Freedom was formed at CUSA, they went to Robert Morris in Dallas, and Morris at the time was not only a member of Young Americans for Freedoms like Ronald Reagan and Mr. Charles Willoughby and Adolphe Menjou, the whole gang that worked closely together, but this group had a West Coast mentor in the name of Patrick Frawley, the Knight of Malta from the Vatican. And as I say, I hope this isn't confusing for you, but the network goes from coast to coast, from the Archdiocese in New York with Cardinal Spellman and Roy Cohn, and down New Orleans with Ed Butler and Lee Harvey Oswald and Dr. Oschner, Dr. Alton Oschner, who I mentioned before was not only the head of the American Cancer Society, but worked closely with Elmer Bobst and also had a part with Mr. Patrick Frawley out on the West Coast. Bill Buckley was a writer for Frawley's newspaper. He prints the weekly tabloid Twin Circle. It's a Catholic newspaper that he keeps publishing. And the fellow in charge of that newspaper is Reverend Daniel Lyons, described as a hawk in Vietnam, an associate of Mr. Diem in South Korea, the favorite darling of Cardinal Spellman. He became Secretary General to the Free Pacific Association in 1965, and Twin Circle, the publishing magazine that Frawley got out, became a subsidiary of Schick Investment Company. Frawley Enterprises took over the Twin Circle, and they began to sponsor the Bob Hope, Billy Graham days and honoring them with the Twin Circles, owned jointly by Schick and Technicolor. And they used the Hearst columnists, Jim Bishop, Bob Considine, William Buckley, Phyllis Schlafly, and the Manions. Both of Clarence Manion and his wife from the John Birch Society were on the board of Western Golds in 1983-82 with their computer into the Los Angeles Police Department. And Lyons wrote a book, Communism on Trial, and worked with the Young Americans for Freedom in 1968 and continuously with them. He's part of the American Security Council's entourage with Dr. Stephen Posenay, and I'll do more on that soon. On the World Anti-Communist League and John Singlaub, again of Western Goals, and the John Birch Society with the police data computers, and Major Edgar Bundy, all part of Mr. Lyons' team of the anti-peace, pro-Vietnam, anti-communist, very much for the war in Southeast Asia, or anything that the Americans did that would get us whipped up for that war against communism. And they've been working closely together for a long, long time. Now, in the book, Power on the Right, Ed Butler, working for Patrick Frawley, describes his role in Inca as an agent provocateur, which is exactly what he does. And he said he's the private master of agitation professional conflict managers. He said you infiltrate troublemaking groups, you divert them from their goals, you break up their structure, you create internal dissension. You only need a few people. Sometimes you can drop a tear gas grenade, and you go with the people pretending that you're working with them, and you actually are clubbing their leaders. They are conflict managers, professionals, and I mentioned once before that the attitude they had, that they are the ones that will decide for the people what is good for them. Now, Mr. Frawley also had a fellow that he was very impressed with, an actor in Hollywood. And in the book Power on the Right, that I've quoted before for the parts about Lauren Hall and William Seymour and the assassins from Dallas and New Orleans that were in California and were never sent back to trial. In the book Power on the Right, it tells about Mr. Frawley and how he was so close to Phyllis Schlafly. He helped get out that book, A Choice is Not an Echo, that she wrote about Senator Goldwater, and his running for president. But it says Frawley played an equally important role in the political career of Ronald Reagan. The actor's candidacy was, in fact, launched by Frawley and three of California's craggiest conservatives. This is Bill Turner writing. Henry Salvatore of Western Geophysical, oil exploration that's now merged with Litton Industry, auto dealer Holmes Tuttle, and A.C. Rubel of Union Oil. They were all active with Frawley in the Goldwater campaign, and now they perceived in Reagan the man to use to pick up the torch. This is Frawley and Salvatore and these people. Now, they not only select Reagan to pick up the torch in those early days but they also work, as I say, with Ed Butler and with Robert Morris and Dr. Oschner on the team that were directly involved with various parts of the assassination. They, like Ronald Reagan, they spearheaded a group for him. Salvatore had raised $1 million for Goldwater, and he began to put other millions of dollars into the Ronald Reagan career. And they pushed this, and along with Mr. Frawley, they had Walter Knott of Knott's Berry Farm. And I mentioned before members of the inner team who picked up Ronald Reagan, and then they got Spencer Roberts. This is the group that went to Spencer Roberts that I mentioned had done the mind control and took care of Ronald Reagan, and they made up their mind that they would make Reagan attractive to the backers in the first place. They would make him tone down the little speeches, put up a war chest, and put him in the charge of the public relations firm of Spencer and Roberts. And then his swing to the right began, and the witch hunt in Hollywood with George Murphy. And Murphy, again, is on the salary of Technicolor. And then Reagan is active begins to date Nancy Davis, whose father is very much part of the American Medical Association. Dr. Oschner was part of the American Cancer Society. William Donovan was put on the board of the Cancer Society when he came home after World War II with the OSS. The Cancer Society became a very political activity for the spy ring, and that's why I'm suspicious of how much cancer there is today and how fast it is spreading. The book Power and the Right says Frawley was sufficiently buoyed by Reagan's landslide victory in the general election of 1966 to help promote the abortive Reagan for President movement in 1968, but then it got off the ground, and of course the rest is history. Pratt Frawley was instrumental in creating Ronald Reagan. Now, he was also working hard with the various church groups, the ultra-right wing, so you can see why it was important that Reagan not extradite the very people back to the grand jury in New Orleans that might open up a can of worms going to Ed Butler or any of the other conspiracies that Jim Garrison could attach to or associate with the people that he wanted back there, like Gordon Novell from Permandex and Eugene Bradley, and that would lead to the Albert Osborne, the missionary who actually had the school for assassins, and a whole can of worms would have opened up. It was very necessary to stop sending anybody to Jim Garrison and let the investigation fall on its face. In the book Power on the Right, or Danger on the Right, Power on the Right by Bill Turner, he tells about Frawley over and over again with his political links, as I say, to the Schlaflys, who are very close and funding Pat Robertson and the Christian right and making decisions on prayer in school or the Equal Rights Amendment and the anti-women vote that they've mustered together to turn down the right of women to have a lot of opportunities that other people are striving for them to obtain. Those people that work closely with Frawley are part of the American Security Council, very important with the Roman Catholic hierarchy, and right in the middle of them fit Ed Butler as the employee of Patrick Frawley, doing his role and then coming home from New Orleans after Kennedy was killed to be in the printing business and writing for Frawley and setting up more provocations in Watts and other areas. And Ed Butler, again, was the first person who wrote Did Hate Kill Tate?, trying to blame the blacks for the killing of Sharon Tate. So that was while he was working for Patrick Frawley. In this book, Power on the Right, it says J. Fred Schlafly Jr., an Illinois attorney, past president of the ultra-right Defenders of the American Liberty, was part of the Ever-Sharp board. Dr. Alton Oschner from New Orleans, a physician from New Orleans Information Council of Americas, was on the board of Ever-Sharp Razor. And I'll do more on Ever-Sharp, not the razor, the Schick's the razor, Ever-Sharp's the pen. Fred Schlafly Jr., the Illinois attorney, retired General Thomas S. Power of the American Security Council, and Dr. Alton Oschner. And again, it was Oschner on the record. Oschner, knowing Oswald was a Marxist, a doctor from New Orleans, working with Ed Butler and being on the board of Frawley's Ever-Sharp at the time that this setup is being made to get Lee Harvey Oswald as the patsy and sell us the Marxist story. Well, the time is running out now. I want to do a little bit more on Patrick Frawley, Phyllis Schlafly, Dr. Oschner, and Ed Butler, and Oswald and Robert Morris, because I think you can see, or I hope you do, that this is a neat little team that through the years has stayed together and gotten this man into the White House to be President of the United States. This is Mae Brussell. The time is out now, and the tape does run out, so we'll stop, and I'll be back with you next week.